Well, hey guys. I wasn't really planning on making a video today, but I just got told that someone wanted me to make this video, and so I've decided to take a plunge and just go ad hoc on story time. So the topic of today's video is how I accidentally met my hero. And this is a topic that again ties in law and life, and I think free spirit and lawyer. So when I was coming up in the law, I was really fond of legal memoirs, if you can believe it. And that I think is because I was very fond of memoirs my whole life. And I always found like real life to be so exciting and real people to be so interesting that I just loved reading about interesting events and themes in people's real lives. I had happened to read the memoir of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor several times. And this is not like a political video. I've actually read pretty much all the justices who have published memoirs who are still alive, and even some who have deceased. I've read most of their memoirs. But hers really spoke to me on many beats. She also came up in, the outskirts of New York. She talked about growing up in the Bronx, and I spent many of my early years in a town in the Bronx. And she had a younger brother who eventually became a doctor, and she had a really, she was kind of in the projects, and she had a really difficult household and was, her parents were immigrants from Puerto Rico, and her father battled alcoholism. And I think what also stood out to me is that she was a very self-sufficient and independent woman. I think her memoir opens with a scene of her learning to give herself insulin because she had type 1 diabetes, and talks about growing up at a time when the treatments for type 1 diabetes were still relatively novel and scary. And so I think between her describing her family life, her personal struggles with this ailment she had to deal with, her growing up in the same area geographically that I grew up in, her having the immigrant sort of beat, and then going to these school districts that were less privileged, but eventually using education to climb into more privileged worlds, I just read her book and I was blown away. A, by the honesty, and then B, by just how many themes she went into. I mean, getting into marriage and divorce and loss and what it's like to be an adult, now when she talks about the kinds of children she has who aren't like necessarily, her children. There were just so many honest things in this memoir, and compared to other judges, like no judge had gone there. So I read this book when I was early on in law school, and it was so captivating. It really touched me. And then I read it again. I can't remember if I read it maybe a year later, but my own father ended up passing away, and her story had a lot to do with how she reconciled the loss of her father, and how she kind of knew from a young age that he was a bit of a self-destructive figure, and so she wasn't entirely surprised, even though she was obviously very saddened when she lost her father. And it just happened to be that she wrote about how she didn't get an offer from the first law firm where she was a summer associate. I didn't have that same fate. I was spared, but it was scary being an associate in big firms where I didn't feel like I belonged. And so her book offered me so much comfort. And years later, I read her book a third time, and I think I just read it to remind myself, to see if the magic I had once experienced was still there. So in those kind of senses, as like this legal giant, she was such a hero of mine. I also happen to have worked for a bunch of different federal judges in my own legal career. When you work for a federal judge and you sit in their federal courthouse every day, you do a lot of their research, you write the first drafts of their opinions, sometimes you're writing the final drafts of their opinions, and they're definitely the court-facing face, but you may not know that they have a whole team often of these little research minions behind the scenes, and they're their judicial law clerks. And we are the people who are doing a lot of the research and writing, and honestly, it's kind of fantastic because you get exposed to so many areas of the law, and you really learn the craft of writing and of thinking about different issues in society. And I always felt that law really fundamentally is the study of society. If psychology is like the study of one person, law is like what happens when all these people come together and have to live in the same place. So I clerked 3 times for a magistrate judge, which is the lowest level of the federal judiciary, then for a district judge, which is the middle level, it's like a trial judge, and then for an appellate judge, which is a level of the court which oversees multiple states and has broad jurisdiction. So let's get back to this story of how I met my hero. I remember Sonia Sotomayor came to my law school when I was in law school, and I was so flabbergasted and blown away. I was like, man, what would it take to get in the same room as this woman? What would I even say to her? Like, what would I say to someone who's just been such a hero, whose memoir I have read like 3 times to get me through these hard moments? And of course, I did not have any interaction with her. I was in a sea of students, and there were a couple of very important students and teachers who got to go to a little event by invite only. I was not invited, but she did a very nice chat in an auditorium for our whole law school, and I got to see her and hear her speak. And then she came again to the New York City Bar Association when I was working in New York City, and I again went to a large room and listened to her wonderful remarks and had no personal interaction with her, but just admired her from afar. And then, interestingly enough, when I was in my second clerkship, the judge I was clerking for mentioned that he was friends with Sonia Sotomayor, but not really him, more so his wife, and that they had been in similar geographic communities and legal communities growing up, and that they were very close. And I had just said loosely in comments like, man, if I could ever have a cup of tea with Sonia Sotomayor, I would just want to tell her how much I loved her memoir and how much it helped me through all these hard times, and I just wish I could do that. And that really was the vision I had. I just was like, wow, it would just be so cool to have tea with this woman and be able to tell her, like, she wrote this labor of love. Well, I sort of gave up on that dream of meeting her or talking to her one-on-one, even though for so many years I really did try, and I envisioned and wanted this meeting to happen. And then I ended up making my way through a few different jobs out of New York and through some other states, and landed up in Michigan, where I live now. And I happened to be on a trip last summer exploring beautiful northern Michigan. And unfortunately, on my way back home, I received a call telling me that this dear judge whom I had worked for, who was the second judge I worked for, had lost his wife in a long fraught battle against cancer. And it was so devastating to me because I had met his wife several times and really admired her, and she was such an inspiration and powerhouse. And this judge had been such a dear, dear mentor and friend and ally, and just such a wonderful person in my life that I felt very compelled to go to this funeral and support him and his family in their tough times. So I came back from this trip, and it was kind of after a whirlwind of traveling. And I got a ticket, and my mother and I both went to attend the services for my judge's wife. And while we were sitting in the church, my mom starts like elbowing me, and she's like, "Isn't that Sonia Sotomayor?" And I look around, and lo and behold, inside that church was Sonia Sotomayor. And every single time I had seen her, whether it was in another courthouse, which also happened once, I think I had seen her honestly like 4 times in public places for different speaking events. She comes to New York City all the time, and I used to live there, so I had seen her at lots of public events, and she always had like her Secret Service agents, you know, whoever, I think they are the Secret Service, with her, and you know, you really can't get that close to her, and she's such a public figure. But there were no Secret Service agents, at least not that I could see, like inside this service in the church. And she was just in the front row and sitting with different friends and family who were there to grieve this event. And that was the only reason I had gone to this event. I really admire my judge. He is someone I love so much, and I just wanted to show support to him. And she had basically come there, I think, to do the same thing. And so my mom is like, "You have to say hello, you have to say something, you have to say something." And I remember telling her, I cannot do that. Like, we're in a church. This is not the right occasion. It's not going to look good. And my mom's like, "She's right there. You've always wanted to." And so I took the plunge. My mom was like breaking my ribs, and I went up to her and I started talking to her, and she held my hands in her hands and she listened, and I told her how much her memoir meant to me, how it had gotten me through really tough times, how very few people write such personal memoirs and really don't get into the depths of what they're going through. And maybe I'm thinking of YouTube as a substitute for in case I never write a memoir, but I just think there's something really brave and courageous of putting those inner turmoils and inner battles out for the public to dissect and feed off of, and to do it when you have, such a high position and so much, I don't know, just margin for being abused, for being vulnerable. I just really commend her for being one of the few judges who really went that far. And so I got to tell her about it and have a moment with her and talk to her and sit, and she held my hands. And so this sort of small little vision or dream I had once upon a time of wanting to meet my hero and have a meeting with her one-on-one and tell her about how much I loved her work ended up happening all these years later in circumstances that I would never have expected. And so I think there's just something really fantastic about having dreams and goals that you almost cast out on a fishing rod, and you just let go of them once you cast out that rod. You don't go chasing the fish in the ocean trying to catch them, because I don't think that's the way that those dreams and goals are necessarily meant to happen. You just set out the fishing rod, and if a fish is meant to catch onto it, it will. And if it doesn't, that's okay, because in your lifetime you can set out so many of them, and some fish are gonna stick. And so it was just this very beautiful full circle moment, and I couldn't have asked for anything better. It was just a cool little anecdote that I'll always have in my heart. She probably will never even remember this or this interaction or know of me or anything like that, but I think that the sort of karmic nature of it is something that I will always remember. And I just thought that for a little story today that touches both on law and life, I would share this story about how I met one of my heroes. So thank you all for listening. I hope you enjoyed this story, which did come by a request, and I hope you all have a beautiful rest of the day. Thank you so much. See you in the next one.